Hello everyone, and welcome back to Everything Anything Computing. I'm Miss Monte, and this is lesson 6 of our Android Development with Kotlin course. In this lesson, we're going to go deeper into Kotlin language with real logic, real examples, and very beginner-friendly explanation. In our last lesson, we mentioned that we will be using a rental management system, or if you may, a land management system, to explain the different concepts within the Kotlin language. And that is what we did in our previous lesson, where we were covering variables and data types, and it was basically how to hold different kinds of information within the Kotlin language. If you missed that one, the link is in the description, or you can click on the top right corner of this video and you'll be directed to that lesson. Today, we'll be covering something different, but an extension of what we had learned previously. So, the first thing we're going to cover in this lesson is making decisions using conditionals, work with list and array to store multiple values, understand null safety, which helps keeps our app from crashing, and finally we will wrap up with a short recap. So let's start with conditionals, making decisions. Let's say you are managing tenants in a building and you want to assign rooms depending on their age, or maybe show them a message if rent is due. How do you go about that? So that's where conditionals come in. In this lesson, we'll cover two types of conditional statements. The first one is the if-else, and the second one is the when. Okay, so let's look practically into section 1 of our lesson, which is conditionals. And basically what we're trying to do is, how can I use my Kotlin language to make decisions when I am building different applications? So we will go back to our problem or our solution, which is basically a rental management system. And in this case, we want to look at two conditions. We want our landlord to be able to check if the tenant has paid their rent. If they paid the rent, then a condition should be met. And if they haven't, also a condition should be met. And then another thing we're going to look into is when a landlord is trying to lease their property, they need to check the age of the person who is trying to lease their property. So if the person is less than 18 years old, then a condition should be met. And if they're more, then a condition should be met. So that's the whole idea of conditionals with our Kotlin language. And today we're going to look at two conditionals. First is the if-else, and then the second one we will look into is the when. So let's start with the if-else condition. So in this case, first things first, let's create a variable. So val is rent paid is equals to true. So in this case, we have created a memory allocation. So if you watched my first lesson, as I mentioned, it's right at the top corner of this video, or you can look at it in the description box. So if you looked at my first lesson, you understand what we're doing here. We are basically creating a variable. And in simpler terms, that means what you're telling our compiler is, I want a memory, and inside that memory, I want it to hold a value called true. And every time I want to reference that memory, I will use this name, is rent paid. So this is like a label. This is the value, and this whole process is a creation of a memory. So that's the whole idea. So we've created a memory. Inside the memory, we are calling it true, and the memory itself is called is rent paid. So we are going to write now our if condition, if, and then we are going to refer to our memory in that case. So if that memory holds, so if that memory holds a value of, so if that memory holds a value of true, then print line rent has been paid. And then, so that is our first condition that we're looking at. This is our first condition. Now let's check at our second condition. Else. If it has not been paid, what do I want to print? Print line please pay your rent. So basically, that's what we are trying to check. we're trying to check within our memory if a condition has been met. And if that condition is met, then let something be printed. But if it is not met, let another thing be printed. So we're just going to run our code and see how that would work. Okay, we can see here it is rent has been paid. But what if we change this to false? You can see here it tells you, please pay your rent. So now you see how this our program or this language can actually be used to solve real life problems within our application. So now let's go to the second part where we're talking about the age. So val age is equals to, let's say 14. So, and then we can go back to our if condition. If age is greater than or equals to 18, then let us print this tenant is eligible. And then else, let us print, we need a guardian to lease. So that's what we are printing right now. So now if you look at this thing correctly, we say that we have a tenant whose age is 14, and this tenant is trying to lease a property with us. But before we do anything, we want to check if he is appropriate to lease a property with us. So if we run this, you can see it says we need a guardian to lease. So meaning this, if we have this checker in our application, we will never rent out to a person who is less than 18. Now, there's another thing I want to introduce here. And this is something called the logical operators. And basically logical operators, these are operators that are going to allow us to look into more than one condition, if you may. So there are three main types of logical operators, and I'll just explain that further. We have the and, the or, and not. And basically what this is, if you use and, which is usually written as this way, this is how you usually use it. If you use that, it means if both of the conditions are met, if both of them are true, then the response should always be true. Yeah? And then if you use or, which is usually written like this, it checks if either one condition is met. In and, it ensures that both conditions are met. So if you have more than one conditions that you want to check within your system to ensure that whatever it is you want to achieve has been met, then you can use and, or not. So basically and is, it checks more than one condition and it ensures that it is important that whatever it is you're checking, each condition is actually met. But this one, it just checks either one of the condition is met, then it will also return true. And then we have now not. Not basically what not does, it inverses the boolean that was created. So if you have a condition that was true, you can use not in front of it to inverse what you had initially created to be true. So now let's just look at this. Let's try and check if our user's age is 14 and if he is eligible, if he can pay rent. So here, let's just change this to can user pay rent, in that we are checking at his bank account. So here we're going to create another variable called val can user pay rent, and we're going to return as true. So if we look at this logically, we just want to check, can this user in his bank account, does he look like a person who is eligible to pay our rent? Then yes, return true. If no, return false. And then we already have the user age, which is 14. So you're going to check on both of them. So we will have more than one if else condition. Let me just write so that you can see. So we're going to check this way. If can user pay rent is true and age is greater than or equal to 18. So if both conditions are met, we can print the user is eligible. Else, if we introduce another condition and we say he can pay, but we need a guardian. And then finally else, open and close. Then we do the print. So this is when, if all the conditions have not yet been met, you can just print this. So here in this case, you're just saying print this user is too young, not eligible. So now we will try and see where our user is going to fit in this case, or rather our tenant. So let's just run this file and see first. So here we have this user is too young, not eligible. And the reason as to why the user is too young is because the user is 14. So let's turn it and give him 17. Let's see 17. He can pay, but we need a guardian. And the reason as to why he can pay, it's because the can user is true. He can pay because maybe the bank account is loaded, but his age is just too young, so we still need a guardian. And finally, let's just put it at 20 and see what that happens. So yeah, the user is eligible. So now you can see this logically. Where can I use this if else conditions and so on and so forth? You can see them practically and how they can be used. So another thing you can try is, let's turn this to or. Actually, let's turn this to or. And let's see what that happens. So here we still have the user is eligible, and the reason as to why the user is eligible is because we can remove this. Yeah. So let's just see if one condition is met, will it still print? And you can see here, it was printed, the user is eligible. But if we have both of them as false, then the user is too young, he is not eligible. But what if we have or here? Or. So or is if either one of the condition is met, then it is okay. So let's see, the age here is met. Okay, so let's run this and see, because he is 20 years old. And you can see it has printed, the user is eligible. So those are the things that you can think. And then now if we use not, we are just going to negate this. And let's run and see. And have this as 14 or 13. So we said or is if either one of them is met. Yeah. In this case, because here was a false and we've negated it and it has become a true, it means that one of these condition is met, which is, can user pay rent? Yes, we've negated this and made it a true. So you can see here, the user is eligible. Okay, so I hope now you've understood the whole idea of logical operators, the if-else condition. And now we can move to another condition called the when condition. The when condition is almost when you have too many options. Let's go back to our rental management system. If I am a landlord, I may have a property which has different types of rooms. I can have a studio apartment, I can have a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom, a 4-bedroom, and so on and so forth. So instead of using it inside a conditional statement where you'll have so many if-else condition, you can move ahead and just use a when condition. It is similar to a switch in other different types of programming languages. So let's just try and see where a when comes in. So we have a variable here, and we are creating a variable of room type is equals to, we can make it studio. Room type is a studio, yeah? And then we can go ahead and now create our when condition. When and then let's just copy and paste this. So now, in this case, what we're telling our computer is, or our compiler is, I have a memory allocation of a user whose room type is studio. So if it is studio, check through all the cases that we have here. If that condition is met, then print something. So when you print here, because our room type is studio, then what will be printed out will be the tenant chose a studio apartment. But what if they print this? And we can change this to this. And we can run it. And what you see here is the tenant chose a 2-bedroom apartment. So you can decide based on what you want to achieve. You can always pick which conditional statement you want to use. These are the two main ones that I'd like to show you, but there are more others that are out there. But now you know the type of conditions and how to write them when you need them. So let's go to, in section 2, we're going to look at lists and arrays. And lists and arrays. So let's just start with lists. Sometimes you would want to store multiple values of the same type within one list. Yeah. Imagine you want to store the names of every tenant within your property. You'd have to create a variable or a memory allocation for each tenant. So variable tenant 1 is equals to Amina, variable tenant 2 is equals to Douglas, variable tenant 3 is equals to Salome, and so on and so forth. So you're creating so many variables, and yet all these names can be listed in one list of variable, or basically one memory allocation. So let me just show you what that means. Variable tenants equals to list of, just for now, let's make it simple. And then Amina, Noela, Mark. So all these are list of names of your tenants that you have. And then if you want to print out the names of all the tenants, you'll just write print line and then tenants. Now when you run, you can see we have here Noella and all those, or you can have also a comment and just say, these are my tenants. And then we will look into string interpolation and everything on strings, so don't worry about right now the $sign. We'll focus that in our later lessons. So now you can see we have these are my tenants. I can change that. One thing you need to know is that when you create a list of, if you use this keyword, and I told you programming is about communication. So if you use this keyword list of, you should know that you cannot change this list. You cannot add, you cannot remove, you cannot do anything. But what if you want to change? Sometimes when you have your tenants, real life tenants, you might have a property that didn't have a person, and then later on your property gets a person. So how do you do that? Let's create tenants of property 1. So we have tenants of property 1. Yeah, I can have it as a name of property 1. So tenants of property 1, instead of using list of, you can use something called mutable list of. So when you use mutable list of, you're basically telling your compiler that I have a memory allocation which has a list of different tenants names here, but I can always want to add. Sometimes I can change them when I need to. So here we can have tenant.add. And basically what this dot annotation or this dot annotation means is we are adding a method onto our list. There are usually many different methods that you can use with your lists. Could be add, could be remove, and so on and so forth. Or remove at specific point and so on and so forth. So in this case, add Juliet. And then now when you print line, so this is tenants property 1. And then you run this. You notice now that we have Juliet in it. Another thing we want you to learn is how to access a value. So right now you can access all of them, but what if you just want to access Amina? So one thing you need to know that every time you put values within a list, they're usually indexed. Yeah, indexing means that each value has an position within that within that memory. So there is position 1, position 2, position 3, and so on and so forth. But with list, it usually starts at position 0. So if you want to reference a value of at position 1, you'll always start at 0. That's how the indexing is. So in this case here, if I want to reference my first value, so now it brings Amina. Okay, another thing that we can use also is something called the arrays. So var, so this is when you know for a fact that you have a property that has 2 floors and you'll never go up with the properties. There will always remain rooms of 3 or 4. And you want to maintain, you can have a property name and then you can have the array of all the number of rooms that you have. Okay, so far you've learned about if-else conditions, or basically conditional statements, and then now we are on section 2, which is lists and arrays. And finally, we can look into null safety. So we can look into null safety now. And basically null safety is when you have, sometimes you might have a value within your application that does not need to be assigned a value. So basically you have a variable that does not need to be assigned a value. And we said a variable is a memory that you've called using your language and using your compiler. And that memory, you've assigned it a value. But sometimes imagine you have a tenant and you haven't assigned it, the tenant hasn't been able to have a phone number by the time they were getting into your property, or they didn't have an ID number. So what happens is you're just trying to tell your compiler this value, this memory should remain as is, but it can always remain also empty. It can always be empty. So if you don't do that, every time your compiler gets to that value, it will crash. And you don't want, because you cannot have a memory that is empty. Every memory that you declare always has to have a value. So in that case where your memory is empty, you don't want it to crash, you use the null safety. And it's usually written as a question mark. So let's just try and do that. So now let's look into something called the null safety. And basically what the null safety is sometimes you have a value that you do not want to assign it, or you have a variable that you do not want to assign a value immediately. Think about when you have a tenant coming into your property, and at that point they still don't have a phone number, or they don't have a mobile phone, so you can never call them on a personal number. But you always want to have that field every time you want to include a tenant. You can tell your compiler that, and you can tell your compiler that this value for now, just it can be empty or it can have a value. In this case, this is how you usually write it. You declare a variable, you call it the name, and when every time you're using a null safety keyword or method, you usually need to explicitly mention that this type of information will be a string, or it will be an integer, and so on and so forth. So here when you run your computer, it will be safe because it is. And then another thing that you can use is called an Elvis operator. And basically an Elvis operator, you write it after you've accessed or you've referenced your value, and then you tell it if it is empty, then you can have a default value of 0. So now when you look at your phone number length is 0, it means that it took up the default value of 0.